वालेकुम सलाम।
आपको बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, आपने ये बुध की रात हमारे साथ गुजारने का फैसला किया है और बहुत खुशी है कि आप आ सके हैं। Just just a few words on what TCI has been attempting to do and tried to do last year, and this is the first of our programs for this year. It is a response to, on one level, crisis that affects the institution that's called the university. It is a matter, university here means at the broadest level. Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, the list goes on and on. Leave aside how it started or the historical origins of the university, where it stands today is very clear. It is a collection of silos. It's a collection of silos where individuals belonging to a particular silo are doing work in their own little silo. And they're aware that there are other silos in their immediate environment, but they do not have the language, the ability, and maybe even the willingness to interact with people outside of their silos. This is a defining characteristic of the university at the beginning of the 21st century. And there can't be any debate on this. This is like the global warming crisis. There can't be any debate that there is a crisis. Now, obviously, there are people who say that this is a hoax, that global warming and climate change is a hoax, that there is no such thing. Now, obviously, people who are pushing that or who adopt that position, they are protecting some very, very entrenched interests. So similarly, if someone wants to argue that the silo culture does not define the type of scholarship that is being done in the university, they are like the climate change and global warming deniers. This is just a fact. And the TCI initiative is an attempt to bring attention to the consequences of this, what happens to scholarship which is done in this environment. So that's at the global level, and whatever university there is in the global south, it is basically, if we want to be honest about it, it is not more than a faint echo of the universities in the West. That's all it is, and I'm being very charitable when I call it a faint echo. I can use more accurate words, but then those are not considered politically correct, and people get offended by the use of those words. So that is, so whatever university there is in the global south, it is afflicted by the same disease. I see Anjum Nasim Saab is here. He was the dean when I came to Hums many years ago. And I remember second semester, I went to his office, and there was a gentleman who was already present in his office. All I remember, I don't remember his name, but he was from the University of Oregon. And Anjum Nasim Saab was nice enough to say, ask me, Basit, sit and listen to the conversations going on. And he was the provost, if I recall correctly. He was at a very senior position. And this is exactly, we have two provost and the dean speaking to each other. And this is what he said. Yeah, look, I am a provost, I'm in this position, and all I'm doing is I'm managing like 23 different institutes or departments, and that's it. and these institutes and departments have no meaningful working, academic, intellectual working relationship with each other. What I'm calling a silo, पुराने ज़माने में इसको कहते थे कुआं, कुएं का मेंढक. मतलब है कि ये जो the scholarship is being done by Mandaks who are only aware of the kuan that they belong to. So, yeah, so the degree that that Lums University is copying so-called best practices. So they have imported this characteristic also. That is at the global level. Then at the local level, the fact that Lums is not in the West. It is an institution in Pakistan. It is an institution in Lahore. Then the institutions in Pakistan or in the global South have some other issue, another issue that is particular to them. Okay, and what is that issue? I don't know who the poet is, and I hope I can say his poetry or एक शेर है, मैं उसको सही तरह अदा कर सकूं, मैं अरबी बंदा नहीं हूँ. What is that? What is the condition of these institutions of the global South? It is. मैंने देखा है कि फैशन में उलझकर अक्सर तुमने असलाफ के इज्जत के कफन बेच दिए. नई तहजीब के बेरू बहारों के इवज अपनी तहजीब के शादाब चमन बेच दिए. Okay, this share describes the condition of not just the elite educational institution in the global South, especially in the Muslim world. It describes the condition of the elite institutions, all other institutions, that a mindless repetition and a mindless mimicry of paradigms that have been, paradigms and ideas that have emerged at some other place in the world. This does not mean that we do not interact with ideas and trends and whatnot that have emerged in the other places in the world. That's not what it means. What it means is we do not mindlessly, uncritically, just repeat them in their language. I mean, that's the irony of that. Even the language and any one of them, meaning where these ideas originated, when they come here and they see the natives mindlessly repeating them, they can pick up very easily. इनको कितनी ये हमारी बात वाकई समझ आई है और कितना ही बस ये रट्टा लाया हुआ है इन्होंने ना समझ कुछ नहीं है. So we may be impressing each other, and we may be impressed by we may be impressing ourselves in our ability to do this mimicry, but the outsiders, they're not so easily fooled. So the Two Cultures Initiative, the second issue it wants to address, or the second problem, is this: the marginalization of indigenous knowledge, indigenous sources, indigenous tradition. That अपनी तहजीब के भी कोई हैं चमन, शादाब चमन. And that's the only thing that the global South meaningfully has to contribute to the global West, is somehow or other to recover that which is unique to their cultural context, so that the global West can develop a perspective on the knowledge that they have generated in a more critical and a more reflexive manner, which they have lost the ability to do at this point in history. So this is what the Two Cultures Initiative is all about. It is to address these two issues, the issue of the silo and the issue of mimicry. And I was so delighted. As soon as I heard, or somehow I came across Ahsan Rana Saab's book, that he had written this book, someone sitting in the School of Business, a professor in the School of Business, has written a book in Urdu on this topic. And the topic, if you look at it, it's not a topic in business per se. It could come under economics, history of economics. It can come under political economy. It can come under political science. So number one, to see a professor, to see a professor sitting in the business school touching on topics, right, which belong in the school of social science and humanities, or humanities and social science. Very, very refreshing. The fact that he did it in Urdu was even more refreshing. Oh, Lams the professor Urdu de vich lekh raha hai. Saab usi ki Urdu de vich scholarship on this topic? Eh? I don't know how that's going to look on your CV. I don't know if you're going to raise the status of your CV or to bring it down. That was very, very refreshing. So जब पता चला कि राणा साहब ने लिखा है, मैंने उसी वक्त ज़हन बना लिया था कि इनको ज़रूर दावत देंगे. And then to find a colleague in the economics department. So we have someone from the School of Business and then a colleague from the economics department, not just any colleague. This is Dr. Faisal Badi. And those who are from LUMS don't need any introduction to either of these two gentlemen. We're very happy to have them. They'll be the ones who will be interacting. And for those who do need an introduction, first, Dr. Ahsan Rana, who will give the presentation for about 40 minutes. He's an associate professor of social policy at the Suleiman Dawood School of Business at LUMS. He obtained his master's in social planning and development from the University of Queensland in Australia, and a PhD in development studies from the University of Melbourne. He has extensive and experiential understanding of public policy and government. Practically, he was a member. He was a servant in the Pakistan Administrative Services and as a consultant for international development organizations. His research interests include welfare capitalism, particularly in Pakistan. He has authored several journal articles, book chapters, management cases, and working papers on the subject. His research has culminated in his book. So this book is not just a mere academic exercise. At one level, the starting point is his lived experience. His lived experience as a practitioner in the field, and then he writes it as an academic. Again, a wonderful combination. It's not a purely academic exercise, and it's not purely an autobiographical account, so to speak, or a first-person account of. So it's a mixture of both. Again, cutting across those divides, which define scholarship, largely define scholarship in the university. So the book is Hank Kib Kuch, a comprehensive treatise in Urdu based on 3 years of research and multiple academic reviews and revisions and like 30 years of personal experience. So Dr. Saab, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I will invite you to give your presentation, and then I will invite Dr. Faisal Badi to respond when the time comes. Please.
Thank you. जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम. आप सब दोस्तों का शुक्रिया, आप लोग तशरीफ़ लाए. मैं ख़ास तौर पे जो स्टूडेंट्स हैं, आई एम ग्रेटफुल टू दैम, क्योंकि आई नो कि मिड टर्म चल रहे हैं, उसके बावजूद फाउंड टाइम, सो आई एम रियली ग्रेटफुल टू यू. और बासित साहब ने एक चार्जशीट पेश की है यूनिवर्सिटी सिस्टम के ख़िलाफ़, और मैंने भी आज एक चार्जशीट ही पेश करनी है और मेरी चार्ज शीट उस सरमायादाराना निज़ाम के ख़िलाफ़ है जिसमें ये यूनिवर्सिटी सिस्टम ऑपरेट करता है. So आज की नशिस्त में basically there are three arguments that I am going to make. The first argument is that capitalism and welfare have a very complex relationship and it's contradictory as well as complementary at the same time. And the second argument is that welfare fulfills several structural requirements of capitalist system. And that's the reason that various countries across the world continue to invest heavily in provision of welfare despite facing massive fiscal deficits. And the third argument is that welfare is structured in a manner that most of the cost is actually borne by the bottom 4 income quintiles. So अगर हम 20% के groups में बांट दें, so the bottom 4 quintiles, they bear the largest cost and the most of the benefit actually accrues to the top quintile. So these are the three arguments. And before I come to the discussion of contradictions and complementarities between welfare and capitalism, I want to make three preliminary points. The first point is that welfare accounts for a very substantial proportion of government spending around the world. If you look at developing countries, so they'll be spending on any given year something to the tune of 50% of their annual budgets on welfare. And if we talk about developed countries, so we are talking about something to the tune of 2/3, and sometimes in social development, social democracy, it's the 3/4 of government expenditure which goes into welfare. So really when we are talking about welfare, we are talking about big money. So in 2021, the British government spent 658 billion pounds on social security, education, healthcare and pensions, etc. It was 69% of their total spending in that year. So it's as large as that. And if we come to Pakistan, in 2024-25, the government of Pakistan will spend around 4 trillion rupees, 4,000 अरब रुपया खर्च करेंगे on provision of subsidies, pensions, and basic income support program, etc., which will be around 38% of federal government's total tax and non-tax revenue. And on top of that, additional to that, the federal government will provide tax exemptions whose size is 4 trillion rupees, another 4,000 billion rupees. So that's the type of money that we are talking about, and this is just the federal government. So the provincial governments, tax welfare, provincial government subsidy and all other things are additional to that. So we are really talking about big money. The second point that I want to make upfront is that welfare is not restricted to cash transfers to the widows, to the needy and the poor. Actually, it's also subsidies, it's also tax exemptions. So in that sense, it is fair to say that all of us are on welfare. So if you just look at the subsidies, so the sugar subsidy and the wheat subsidy would benefit the top income quintiles in exactly the same manner in which it would benefit the bottom quintile. All of you have benefited today, right today, from the sugar and the wheat subsidies. Similarly, if we talk about pensions, so we are talking about big money. In this particular year in Pakistan, the total size of pensions is estimated to be around 2,100 billion rupees. It's a very large money that we spend on pensions. And since this is tax exempt, if we add 20% on average tax to that, we are talking about 2,600 billion rupees. And out of that, only 11% pension goes to employees of grade 1 to 4. यानी वो जो दर्जे चारम के मुलाजिम होते हैं, जो हम कहते हैं कि ये गरीब मुलाजिम, इनकी पेंशनों की हम बात कर रहे हैं, only 11% of the pension goes to them and 63% of the pension goes to employees of grade 14 to 22, which are definitely middle and high income groups. Same is the case with tax exemptions, nominal taxes on property transfers, and so on. So these examples, I think, are enough to show that welfare expenditure is not restricted to the bottom quintiles. Everyone benefits from that. Now, the third point that I want to make upfront is that the money for welfare expenditure is not raised by taxing the rich. It actually comes from the general tax revenue to which everyone contributes. And there is a recent UNDP study which says that about 57% 50.7% of the total direct and indirect taxes of the federal government are contributed by the bottom 4 quintiles. And since federal government also has non-tax revenue, and if we estimate that according to the contribution of these quintiles into indirect taxes, we come up with a figure of 56.9%. So 57% of federal government's tax and non-tax revenue actually comes from the bottom 4 quintiles. And since 41% of Pakistan's population is living below the poverty line, so essentially what we are saying here is that this money is being contributed by 2 bottom quintiles which are living below the poverty line and 2 quintiles which are barely above the poverty line. So these are the 4 quintiles which contribute 57% of the total tax revenue. Now, in some countries, resources for welfare are raised through social insurance. So everyone contributes, everyone benefits, and the unemployment benefits and the health insurance in UK, North America, Europe, so that's a good example of that. So it's a sustainable arrangement because everyone contributes and there is a link between benefits and the contribution. So if you want higher level of benefits, then you should be ready to pay a higher level of contribution. But not so in Pakistan. In Pakistan, we don't have any sizable social insurance. So pension again comes to mind. So we generally think that pension, government employees contribute towards their pension. That's not the case. There are no pension funds in the federal government and the government of Balochistan. The KPK government and Sindh government have pension funds, but there is no money in that. Punjab has a pension fund and there is, in 2022, there was rupees 60 billion only in that pension fund, which would barely finance the Punjab government's pension for maybe 2 months or 3 months, not more than that. And EOBI pensions can be one example of social insurance. So the employees' old age benefit institution, but you might know that the scale of this is very small. The pension which is given to EOBI recipients is between 10,000 and 20,000, and it's only a few 100,000 people. It's actually 300 and something thousand people in Pakistan, in the entire country, who receive EOBI pension. So its scale is very small. In some countries, resources for welfare are raised through specific taxation on income or property or specific type of activities. So India is a good example of that. In India, all people who pay income tax, so they pay an additional 4%, which goes towards financing health and education. Several Indian states have levied specific education taxes on property, on transfer of property, on mining, and some states have levied these taxes on sale and distillation of liquor. Now, since these are specific taxes which can be used only for education, and these are levied on those income groups which are high income groups, so that is a good example of raising resources for welfare by taxing the rich. Now let's see what happens in Pakistan. In Pakistan, there have been 2 efforts to raise resources for public education through specific taxes. But both of these efforts fizzled out very quickly because they were made half-heartedly. The first example that I want to give here is that of a 10% tax which was levied on the membership fee and the services rendered by these elite clubs in Punjab. So it was levied in 2011, it was 10%, and the idea was that that should raise some money which would go into financing education, and this tax lasted only for 4 years. In 2015, the government withdrew that on the ground that these clubs are already paying sales tax on services, so while they are doing that, it would be a case of double taxation if we levy another tax on that. So वो tax जो था वो government ने वापस ले लिया. Now keep in mind that we are not talking about any ordinary club, we are talking about elite clubs. So these are the clubs कि जिनकी membership fee जो है वो runs into millions, and people are queuing to become members. Sometimes you have to wait for years and sometimes for decades to become a member. And when the members visit a club, so they routinely spend thousands of rupees, and yet the government of Punjab was not willing to levy an additional tax on that, 10% on that, to finance education in Pakistan, in Punjab. Another example of the same is the money raised under the Workers' Children Education Ordinance of 1962. So this law requires all registered industrial establishments with a workforce of 10 or more to pay rupees 100 per year per employee, and with that money then the workers welfare fund establishes school, so it is for the education of workers' children. So this law was passed in 1962 and 100 rupee per worker was the rate remained the same. So this is also an insignificant scheme, and actually it has been rolled back because the collection was so small that the provincial governments thought that it is not worth it. So I think it's fair to say, based on these examples, that neither social insurance nor specific taxes go into financing welfare, and welfare is financed through general tax revenue, and now we realize that 57% of that general tax revenue comes from the bottom 4 quintiles. So when we talk of welfare, and as I said earlier, we are talking about really big sums of money, so it's not a case of vertical distribution, it's a case of horizontal distribution. It's not the case that the rich people are being taxed to finance provision of goods and services to the bottom quintiles. It's actually these quintiles which are being taxed to finance these services to them. Okay, so let's now discuss some of the contradictions and complementarities between capitalism and its welfare regime. I think the root cause of the contradiction between capitalism and welfare lies in the fact that welfare undermines the distribution arrangement of capitalism. It's an important point, it's a subtle point, but it's a very important point. If you look at capitalism, so for capitalism, production and distribution are two sides of the same coin. They're intertwined. So the distribution of goods and services is actually decided at the time of production, at the point of production. So it's the relationship of production and how production is carried out which decides who will own and who will get the use rights to the product of the production process. So when the product of the production process emerges from the production process, it does not emerge unencumbered. It has a particular name written on it, the name of the owner, and that owner is a person who already owns all the means of production in the production process, who controls the production process. And since the laborer has already sold their labor power before entering into the production process, so they have no entitlement really on the product which they have themselves produced. Their only entitlement is the wage. So if they want to access that product that they have themselves produced, they can only access it through the market, through the wage. And if for any reasons, for any reason, if their wage is not sufficient enough to buy them that product, or they have not been able to participate in the production process, so they cannot access that. Now, welfare thinks differently. So welfare has a different distribution system which bypasses the market mechanism, and it provides an alternative route to certain groups of people to access those very goods and services whose access was denied by capitalism. So herein lies the tension, that capitalism is trying to have one distribution system with one hand, and welfare is trying to have another distribution system with the other hand. And the second root of the contradiction between the two is that welfare is financed through taxing production, taxing productive activity, taxing economy. And taxation is actually a constraint on capital. If you look at capital has an insatiable desire to grow. It must grow. It can't stagnate. And taxation is then a constraint on that. So we can say that welfare in that sense, because it meets several of the structural requirements, and I'll come to that in a moment. So it's necessary for capitalism, but it's also a constraint. At the same time, the two are also complementary in the sense that capitalism will produce the resources which will go into financing welfare, and also the negative externalities or diswelfares which capitalism creates, so they are addressed through welfare. So there are three examples of these negative externalities which I want to present here. One is that of the surplus population. So one of the main diswelfares that capitalism produces is surplus population. But this population is not surplus in a Malthusian sense. It's not the case that there is not enough food for them. We produce enough food to feed everyone. Rather, this population is surplus because it is surplus to the requirement of capital. Capital does not need them. That's why they are surplus. They can't find work because capital does not need them. And although this population has been rendered surplus because of internal dynamics of capitalism, but their maintenance comes to be the responsibility of welfare. And these people are rendered surplus because of the internal dynamics of capitalism, whereby under the pressure of competition, capitalism continuously revolutionizes the production process, it increases workers' productivity, it changes, it improves business process and so on. And in the process, the number of available work hours have been going down. So there are recent estimates which show us that globally, not only, it's not the problem of Pakistan alone, globally, the number of available work hours have steadily declined during the last few decades. So if there were X billion hours which were available in, let's say, 1990, now there are X minus Y billion hours which are available, and since population is growing, so on a per capita basis, now fewer work hours are available. And since this available work hours are not being widely spread, so we have a situation where we have some people who are employed and they are the lucky ones, and we have a large number of people who are either unemployed or underemployed, and most of these people are, actually most of you will also experience that unemployment is now a fact of life for almost everyone. So almost everyone will experience periods of unemployment, so people are in and out of work, and those times when jobs, stable jobs, long-term jobs were available, so they are now a dream from a distant past. Now, sometimes this existence of surplus population is blamed on government's intervention in the labor market. So it is argued that government, by fixing the minimum wage and by supporting union activity, creates a condition which create this unemployment. And Milton Friedman actually famously went to the extent of saying that the only way women and racial minorities and other disadvantaged groups can find work is by offering their services at a lower wage. But I don't find this argument to be convincing. And I don't think that even in the absence of government intervention, the unemployment will go away. Certainly, at a socially acceptable wage. The wage will have to fall very, very low for unemployment to go down, and that would then start affecting the production process itself. So it is more plausible that capitalism's structural requirements are met through the creation of this surplus population. Whereas Marx famously said that now in modern times, when the use of force is not an option, so how do you discipline the labor power? So the way to discipline labor power is to threaten them with unemployment, and this threat of unemployment will be most effective when out there is a large body of people who are ready to take the place of those people who are being threatened with that. So this is what Marx called as the reserve army of labor. So larger this reserve army of labor, the stronger, the more potent, the more effective this disciplinary apparatus, this disciplinary tool. And capitalism produces two types of surplus population. One is permanently surplus, so people who are physically, mentally challenged, so they have to be maintained. And then there is the relative or the temporarily surplus population. So these are the people who are in and out. So their services may be needed today or tomorrow, but not today or tomorrow. It is important to maintain this surplus population for two reasons. One reason is that this population is only temporarily surplus. So even if their services are not needed today, capital will require their services tomorrow. And the second reason is that the number of these people who are part of this surplus population is simply too large to ignore. There would be social control, social unrest if they are not managed. And there are several ways to manage this part of the surplus population. One is to consign them to households. So we send women to the chadar and char diwari, become a housewife. So that is one way of managing the surplus population. Another way of managing surplus population is to send people to institutions of higher education. Most people globally who are today's pursuing higher education are not doing that because of a genuine love for knowledge or because they genuinely want to improve their skills. They're doing that because they are not for the time being required by the system. So they are surplus. And another way of managing this surplus population is to export them, and states around the world do that very, very regularly. But how many people can you possibly export? Another way to manage this surplus population is to provide them unemployment benefits and to provide them cash transfers. All of these are ways, but all of these ways require taxation. And the greater the taxation, the greater the constraint on the process of capital accumulation. And capitalist states has two principal functions. One is to aid in the process of capital accumulation, and the other is to legitimize the relations of production. So if there is a large surplus population, then there is going to be large taxation. That means there is going to be a large constraint on the process of capital accumulation, which means that that very state which is trying to address one problem through welfare, that is the problem of managing the surplus population, is then failing in another fundamental way, that is failing to aid in the process of capital accumulation. So herein lies the contradiction. Another example of the same is what is called as the primitive accumulation. Now, primitive accumulation is a fundamentally important concept in Marxist thought, and it refers to separation of producers from the means of production. Marx argued that producers, direct producers, have to be separated through the use of force from their means of production, otherwise they will not be ready to participate in the production process as wage earners. Otherwise they would carry out their own production. And he thought that this process predates capitalism, that's why he called it primitive, and it's a precondition for the capitalist accumulation process to take place. So recent scholarship has actually challenged some of these Marxist concepts, and now we know that this process of primitive accumulation is a continuing process, and it's often carried out not through use of force but through economic means. Now, welfare performs very important function in this process of primitive accumulation. So one function that it performs is that it provides the inducements, it provides the economic incentives which would then transition people from direct producers to wage earners. And secondly, there is a lot of surplus population which is produced in the process of this primitive accumulation, so welfare then manages that surplus population. I'll give you one example, that is of the case of hybrid seeds. So you may be familiar that hybrid seeds are produced by crossing distant relatives of the same crop. And that crossing actually produces a certain vigor which is called the hybrid vigor. It's called heterosis. And because of that hybrid vigor, the progeny, the hybrid seed produces crops which are superior in yields and other characteristics, but then the downside is that that superiority is very quickly lost. But you can't retain it. You can't cultivate the hybrid seed in the next cultivation, which means that if you want to cultivate hybrid seed, you'll have to buy it again from the market. And it is this feature which makes hybrid seeds actually the darling of the seed industry. Because once farmers are no longer able to save their seed and they are forced to the market every year for seed, so that means that seed, which is a socially owned means of production, privately owned means of production, now becomes capital. Now it is owned by companies, and companies then get an assured demand for their product year after year. If you look at the case of maize in the United States of America, the hybrid seed of maize was developed in 1920s. And initially when maize seed was developed, so its performance was okay. So it did not outperform the non-hybrid varieties which were in large-scale cultivation in the United States. So there was no reason for farmers to transition from the seeds they could save to the seeds that they could not save. And here government stepped in. So government stopped funding for the conventional varieties and subsidized private research on hybrids. So in no time, in a few years' time, so the hybrids performance was up there and the conventional varieties, their performance stagnated. So that became then the mechanism through which farmers, maize farmers in the United States of America were transitioned from one type of seed to a seed which is now capital. Cotton in Pakistan offers an even more interesting example. So cotton is one crop where hybrids are not successful at all. So there are several efforts locally, elsewhere, to develop cotton hybrids, and these hybrids are absolutely no match as far as local cotton varieties are concerned. And yet, local and national and multinational seed companies have continuously, persistently tried to develop cotton hybrids because of the reason that I have just explained. And Monsanto, which is now it has been taken over by Bayer, but it used to be the largest agricultural company in the world. So they have been negotiating with the government of Pakistan and the government of Punjab since 2006 to introduce their new technologies in hybrid seeds. So they don't want to introduce their new technologies in conventional seeds, they want to introduce these in the hybrid seeds because of the reason that I have mentioned. And since their hybrids cannot compete with local varieties, they want government to subsidize this transition of farmers from the conventional seed to the hybrid seeds. So they want the government to provide subsidy so that the cost of the hybrid seeds is actually at par with the conventional varieties, so that farmers then transition, and in due course this conventional seed will no longer be available, and then the government should be able to withdraw their subsidies. So as I mentioned before, neither in the case of maize nahi cotton ke case mein, it would not have been possible for this transition to happen without welfare. Now the last example in this regard that I want to give is the institution of family. There are several tendencies in capitalism which destroy the institution of family. So there is a regular restructuring, continuous restructuring of the labor market, which throws one spouse to this continent, another spouse to that continent, and a child to that continent. And then there is trend of proletarianization, which is drawing upon the labor of women and children. So all of these are actually causing for a decline and the disruption and destruction of the institution of family. But at the same time, we see a lot of spending being made to preserve this institution of the family. So maternity benefits, child support, nutrition benefits, aid to families with children, all of these are examples where state at great expense by spending billions of rupees is actually trying to preserve this institution of family. So a legitimate question is that what is happening here? Why is it the case that capitalism is destroying the institution of family with one hand, and then it is providing the resources through which the institution of family is being strengthened with the other hand? So I think there are two reasons for that. One is that family is an important location for management of the surplus population. So housewives, I've given that example, then the elderly, the sick, the children. So imagine if all of this surplus population was managed at public expense. Look at the expense. So family then becomes an inexpensive alternative, inexpensive means to manage this very large surplus population. And another reason for capitalism to try to protect the institution of family is that family is the site of reproduction of labor. So this is the place where labor is reproduced on a daily basis and also on an intergenerational basis. So when a laborer returns home after a day's work, they are exhausted, so they must feed themselves, they must clean themselves, they must rest so that they can return to the workplace rejuvenated the next morning. And this process has to be repeated on an intergenerational basis, because one of the responsibility of the worker is to produce another worker who can replace them when they are no longer able to work. And family performs this important function, and this is where women's unpaid labor plays a very important role. Women, by providing unpaid labor or at the cost of sustenance, so the labor that they provide, that actually reduces the cost of reproduction of labor. Now imagine if all of these services, the cooking, the cleaning, and the child care and the care of the elderly, if the laborer had to source these services from the market, look at the cost of his reproduction. It would be over here. Now the woman, by providing free labor, is actually subsidizing capitalist production. And we also know that wage is directly linked to the cost of reproduction of labor. So if cost of reproduction of labor is low because of this function that is performed by women's free labor, that means that it becomes possible for the capitalist to hire the laborer at a lower wage. Another structural requirement of capitalism fulfilled by welfare is that of social control. Now, the maintenance of capitalism requires series of incentives and punishments. So, incentives for social compliance and punishments for deviance. And social compliance is rewarded through scholarships, through job quotas, and so on. And we can cite so the example that comes to my mind is awarding of additional marks to ex-soldiers and to Hafiz Quran at the time of job interviews. उनको अलग से numbers जो है वो मिलते हैं because these two groups then symbolize the ideal types whose traits the state wants to universalize, and welfare then plays a role in that. And similarly, there are several punishments. Conditional cash transfers are a good example of that. So the cash benefit can be withdrawn if the beneficiaries fail to perform at a certain level. And it's interesting, it intrigues me that we expect a much higher level of moral standards and work ethics from the beneficiaries of welfare than we expect from other citizens. Now, welfare also helps in performing the social control function by making the citizens legible. It is the legitimate requirement of any state to make any modern state to make its citizens readable. The more readable citizens are, the governance function is easier, correspondingly easier. And I'll cite the case of Benazir Income Support Program from Pakistan. You will be pleasantly surprised to know that in Pakistan, 96% of the population is registered with NADRA. 96% of Pakistan's population has a CNIC. And it's an impressive achievement. No country in the region has that type of coverage. And this was made possible in large part by BISP. When it became clear earlier on that having a CNIC, उसके बगैर नहीं मिलेगा बेनजीर इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम की असिस्टेंस, तो ये सारी औरतें, बूढ़ी औरतें, लोअर स्ट्रेटा की औरतें who would have never ever applied for that, so they actually queued up in front of NADRA's offices to get themselves registered. और दूसरा बेनजीर इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम ने ये किया कि उसने एक नेशनल सोशल इकोनॉमिक रजिस्ट्री बनाई है, एंड दैट रजिस्ट्री हैज डाटा ऑन 34 million households. Once again, 34 million households. It's 90% of Pakistan's population. So that means BISP has data on a range of indicators on 90% of Pakistan's households. And now this data basis, this registry is dynamic. So new people can also enter, and every existing beneficiary has to report at the BISP centers every 3 years to have themselves photographed, to have themselves fingerprinted, and to respond to several questions. And if you look at these questions, there are several questions which have absolutely no relationship, no connection to ascertaining the eligibility of women for cash transfers. And yet these questions are being asked, and yet that data is being collected. So जो औरतें वहाँ पे जाती हैं उनसे इस तरह के सवाल भी पूछे जाते हैं कि दी माइग्रेशन, वेयर डू यू गेट योर लोन फ्रॉम, आपका पंजाब पुलिस के बारे में क्या ख्याल है, अगर आपको किसी गवर्नमेंट डिपार्टमेंट से शिकायत है तो वेयर वुड यू गो. नाउ हाउ आर दीज कनेक्शंस related to their eligibility for Benazir Income Support Program? So the only answer to that is that this is an effort, this is the role which Benazir Income Support Program is playing in making citizens more legible for the state so that their governance can become easy. और अभी चूंकि पेमेंट उनको होती भी बैंकों के थ्रू है आफ्टर बायोमेट्रिक्स, दैट मीन्स दीज पोर वुमेन विच आर द बॉटम स्टेटा, सो दे आर नाउ आल्सो इंटीग्रेटेड इनटू अ फाइनेंशियल सिस्टम विच इज हैवीली मॉनिटर्ड नॉट ओनली लोकली, ग्लोबली. Welfare also performs a legitimization function for the capitalist system. Now, if we look closely at the capitalist state, at its core, it is its military, its police, its judiciary, its prisons, its magistracy. And all of these are institutions of coercion. If it is only these institutions of coercion which the citizens come across, then the relationship of citizens with the state would be hostile. It would be an animostic relationship. And in an animostic relationship, the cost of governance is very huge. That is the reason that state continuously tries to sugarcoat itself. So it tells people that we are not only prisons. Don't think that we are magistracy. We are also business income support program. We are also the ones who launch flood relief programs for you. We are also the ones who education, free education, safe Sulat card and so on. That's the reason that you continuously see these politicians coming up with one program after the other. अभी पिछले दिनों एक program Chief Minister पंजाब ने शुरू किया धी रानी program. So this is part of the process of sugar coating the state and hiding its really hideous character. The last point that I want to make is that welfare measures disproportionately benefit the top income quintile. If we divide welfare measures according to their functions, we can divide them into three categories. One is social investment, the other is social consumption, and the third is social expense. Social investment refers to all that expense which increases labor's productivity. So education, healthcare, skills training, basic research. And social consumption refers to all that expenditure which reduces the cost of reproduction of labor. So education, healthcare, subsidized housing, clean drinking water, subsidized transport and so on. And social expense refers to that expense which is the legitimization expense, such as the basic income support program. If we talk about social investment, so the expenditure which is made with the express objective of increasing labor's productivity. Now there is a lot of social investment which has been made during the last few decades. And look at the results that it has achieved. Productivity has definitely increased, but workers' real wages have not. There is an interesting study from the United States of America, Pew Research Institute ki study hai 2018 ki, which says that since 1964, workers' wages have increased only marginally, and that increase too has accrued to only their top layer. Average wage of a US worker was $2.1 per hour in 1964. And by 2018, it had increased to $22.65 per hour. Large increase, but it is a nominal wage. Hai na? When you consider inflation, the real wage it increased only by 0.12%. So in effect, the purchasing power of an average US worker is exactly the same today as it was in 1964, despite their productivity having increased substantially because of this social investment during the last few decades, and this social investment was also made at their cost. If you look at Pakistan, the situation is even worse. In Lahore, the daily wage of a laborer in 2006-2007 was rupees 300. And in 2022, it was 1000 rupees. However, in terms of kilograms of wheat flour that it could buy, the purchasing power of daily wager in Lahore has actually gone down. In 2006 mein, he could go home with 34.7 kilograms of wheat flour. And in 2022, he could go home with only 20.8 kilograms of wheat flour. So actually, uski real purchasing power niche gayi hai. So the legitimate question to ask is that if his productivity is increasing and his real wage is going down, then who is benefiting? Obviously, it's the employer who is then gaining the benefit. Social investment. And we also need to keep in mind that if the real wage goes down, then workers' living conditions will deteriorate. And that's where welfare plays an important role. So welfare then constitutes that what is called as the social wage. So worker को दो किस्म के wage मिलते हैं. One wage is from the employer and the other is the social wage, which is basically goods and services which are provided by the government for free or at a subsidized cost. So if there is social wage, then workers can retain their living standards even when their real wage is going down. So this is precisely what is happening. So if you see workers' living standards actually remaining same or sometimes increasing, that is not because of an increase in their real wage, that is because of an increase in the social wage. Okay, so what should we do? What's the resolution? What do we propose? So very briefly, And I can elaborate on that during the question answer. So I think the resolution to this contradiction between welfare and capitalism can be achieved only and only when we stop this practice of viewing production and distribution to separate things. As long as we continue to do that, so then welfare will undermine capitalism, capitalism will undermine welfare. So there will be a tension, there will be a contradiction. So we need to admit that production and distribution happen at the same site. And if we want a different distribution of goods and services, then really we have to change the relations of production. So if workers participate in the production process not as people who have already sold their labor power, but as partners in the production process, then they will have a claim, a direct claim on the production process. And they will have a direct claim on the product of the production process. So they won't require wages to access that because they have a direct claim. So whatever the welfare wants to achieve, so that would then be achieved without any welfare. So the problem would then be resolved permanently without there being any need. And this change in relations of production is nothing more than changing how means of production are owned. So means of production can be either collectivized, their ownership can be collectivized, they can be collectively owned. And in that case, every member of the society will have a share to the product of the production process, or the means of production, their ownership can be widely distributed. Rather than a few thousand or tens of thousand people owning that, the ownership of the means of production would be spread over millions of people. And since these people would then be participating in the production process as owners of means of production, so they will have a direct access to the product. So that would be their direct entitlement. I'll conclude with a quote from Leon Trotsky. To save society, it is not necessary either to check the development of technique, to shut down factories, to award premiums to farmers for sabotaging agriculture, to turn a third of the workers into paupers, or to call upon maniacs to be dictators. Not one of these measures, which are a shocking mockery of the interest of society, are necessary. What is indispensable and urgent is to separate the means of production from their present parasitic owners. I'll repeat. What is indispensable and urgent is to separate the means of production from their present parasitic owners and to organize society in accordance with a rational plan. Then it would at once be possible really to cure society of its ills. All those able to work would find a job, the workday would gradually decrease, the want of all members of society would secure increasing satisfaction, the words property, crisis, exploitation would drop out of circulation, mankind would at last cross the threshold into true humanity. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया राना साहब for that very coherent, very systematic, a very easily understandable argument. It was easy to follow. That doesn't mean that it is easy to agree with. So those are two separate issues. Okay. And I can see Dr. Badi already shaking his head. So thank you. Dr. Badi, I am sorry, I do need my glasses. For those who don't need, right? For those of us who are from LUMS, we don't need an introduction to Dr. Faisal Badi. He's one of our most senior faculty members. But for those who are not from LUMS, Dr. Faisal Badi is an associate professor of economics in the School of Sciences, Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. He's also the CEO and senior research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, IDEAS. He obtained his bachelor's from the University of Oxford, a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Oxford, and his BSc from Government College Lahore.
He holds an MA in philosophy from the University of Punjab and a PhD in economics from McGill University. He has served as the head of economics department and the dean of the Sayyid Ahsan Ali School of Education at LUMS. He has also served as the deputy country director for Pakistan with the Central Eurasia Project and as an education economist for South Asia at the Open Society Foundation. Dr. Bari has consulted for various multilateral and bilateral agencies, including the World Bank, UNDP, DFID, and the Asian Development Bank. He's also a regular columnist for the Daily Dawn. I'm smiling as I'm reading his qualifications and linking it to how hard he shook his head when I said that the ideas presented here are not easy to agree with. So, Dr. Bari, please.
Acknowledge my limited understanding as well, not just the practice, whether agree करना सामने या नहीं. अच्छा, so पहली बात तो ये कि what a labor of love. It's 3 years, huge amount of work, and when knowing that that's not going to do much for the city. वो छुट्टी मंगी थी वो भी नहीं देती लाम में मैंने कहा ऐसा हमने छुट्टी भी नहीं दी और system works through promotions etc. I'm pretty sure ये वाली किताब है उसमें भी ज़्यादा वजन नहीं लगेगी लेकिन वजन पढ़ने से पता लगता है. पहली चीज़ the choice of Urdu. अच्छा उर्दू में किताब लिखनी हो ना वो भी इस टॉपिक पे जैसे इकोनॉमिक्स है ये तो उसमें फिर बहुत सारी आपको और चॉइसेस भी करनी पड़ती है कि अल्फाज जो हैं वो आप उर्दू के ढूंढ के लाएंगे जिन चीज़ों की आप बात करें प्रिमिटिव एक्यूमुलेशन इसका उर्दू में क्या क्या यूज़ करें ऐसे ही कह दें प्रिमिटिव कुछ अल्फाज हैं प्लेटफॉर्म ये वो कंप्यूटर जो हैं अंग्रेजी से आए हुए उर्दू में ऐसे इस्तेमाल होते हैं कुछ हैं जो आप बनाते हैं and those choices can make the reading sometimes hard also अगर मास्टर आपको उर्दू या वैसी समझनी जैसे शायद माजी में हमारी होती थी तो एक तो वो तो what a choice to make कि भाई ये किताब भी लिखनी है और despite institutional issues और वो लिखनी भी उर्दू में so that's a
Thank you.
to you.
Thank you.
I'm still grappling with a lot of what Ahsan Saab has written. मैं किताब 2 दफ़ा पढ़ चुका हूँ इसीलिए मैंने कहा था कि शायद मेरे पढ़ने में तैयारियाँ हो गई हैं तो समझने में वक्त लगेगा. पहली बात so let me start from a very big. I think this issue of a contradiction in capitalism and welfare, a lot of it is stemming from, or will the solution be बाद में Ahsan ने कहा, from this notion of how do we think about define property rights? Right? What is the basis for any property right structure within a society? अगर आप मसलन जो later Marxist हैं उनकी thought देखें तो वो बड़ी clearly ये कहते हैं कि why should we assume the structure of property rights that got developed, say, under the early stages of capitalism or whenever we want to think about property rights being developed. So production, जो आपने कहा कि has already the notion of distribution, because वो worker आ ही रहा है उस वक्त जबकि already वो अपनी work बेच चुके हैं, is partly because it is being determined that rights of property जो प्रायर हम assume कर रहे हैं कि एक कैपिटलदार है जमींदार है दूसरा अपनी लेबर बेच रहा है और वो बहुत ज़्यादा टाइड है इससे कि वो कैपिटल और ज़मीन का नोशन उस प्रॉपर्टी राइट के नोशन के तहत है जिसमें the state of course is protecting that property right as well. तो वो प्रोडक्शन अब है ही जाहिर asymmetric बिल्कुल रिलेशन जिसमें जो owner है of the property right to land and capital is now looking to just hire a person who can change that land and capital to another form और उसके वो उतने पैसे उसे दे देगा। अगर वो बहुत सारे लोग हैं जो कि मार्क्स का बेसिक क्रिटिक था कि भाई लेबर सरप्लस नोशन का एनी लेबर अगर वो बहुत ज़्यादा है तो दैट विल ड्राइव द वेजेस डाउन और वो लिविंग वेज से नीचे होगी। There are no guarantees in the market system ever that the market clearing wage is going to be a living wage. If people are expendable, if they reproduce and die 10, 15 years, so what difference does it make to the owner of the property who's more interested in just getting that labor for a temporary period and is that labor is expendable? It's not, it's the notion of that property right driving the outcomes of the production process. And that creates the contradiction that Ahsan talks a lot about, which is then the welfare as a band-aid or as a balm that allows the basic process of property rights to remain and get maybe over generations even more asymmetric, but keeps the people quiet also. Right? जो बाद में आपने काफी बात भी की भी social control and so on and so forth. Now, so if you want to go deeper into this, then we have to then really look at what's the genesis of this notion, the notions of property right. How do we think about it? Are they immutable? Are they somehow inherently tied to some human condition, or is it a product of our social construction, in which case we can re-engineer them, we can rethink what the optimal notion of property rights should be for a modern society, for a society that is now technologically at a very different stage and state than what it was 200-300 years ago or pre-industrial revolution. This is something that, for example, इसकी एक साइड में अच्छा, so just staying with that, and so given इसमें वो some of the Marxists have really talked about this a lot. मसलन ऐसी examples आप सोचिए कि वो कहते हैं कि भाई why should Babar Azam is asking for X amount of money to show his amazing quality as a batsman. And so we are assuming the talent that Babar Azam has is housed in Babar Azam. But why is the assumption then going with it that therefore he has a right to ask for whatever price he can get from the market for that talent, right? Can we think of that talent which might remain housed in an individual as a property of a society also? पर वो फिर उसमें सवाल इस तरह के आते हैं कि भाई then does that dilute the incentive to work hard for Babar Azam? वो पैसे के लिए काम करता है, अगर वो पैसा नहीं देंगे तो वो काम नहीं करेगा, वो अच्छी बैटिंग नहीं करेगा। ये मैं एग्जांपल बाबर आजम की आज तक तो आउट ऑफ फॉर्म है, लेकिन आप कोई भी सुनने की तो लेकिन ये सवाल तो इट्स पॉसिबल टू रेज ना कि here's a society that trains its people for 15, 20, 30 years to become a doctor, an engineer, a cricketer, and so on. And then that person turns around and says, this is my talent, and now I will only show the mirage of this talent if you pay me this much, right? And one of the theorists from the left, he said कि ये ऐसे ही है कि आप किसी का बच्चा अगवा कर रहे हैं और फिर कहीं रैंसम दो तो बच्चा दूंगा। भाई वो बच्चा तुम्हारा था ही नहीं, तुम रैंसम, ये सारी बात ही गलत है। तो वो कहता इसका मैं इसको बिल्कुल इसके बराबर समझता हूँ कि आप कहें टैलेंट मैं तभी यूज़ करूँगा जब तुम मुझे पैसे दोगे। इट्स वेरी मच लाइक रैंसम। और भाई टैलेंट तुम्हारा था ही नहीं, वो सोसाइटी की प्रॉपर्टी है, वाई शुड वी कंसिडर कि वो तुम्हारी प्रॉपर्टी है। दैट नोशन ऑफ रीडिफाइनिंग property rights completely, not just in terms of possession, but even talent, even something as internalized to a person that can only be housed in a person, but you still question whether that can be a common property or an individual property. ज़मीन वगैरह तो वैसे ही एलियनेबल है ना, तो वो तो कोई वो आपने उसकी एग्जांपल भी दी है कि भाई ज़मीन की ओनरशिप आप वाइडर कर दीजिए, आप एसेट्स की ओनरशिप वाइडर कर दीजिए, आप एजुकेशन ज़्यादा कर दीजिए, वाइडली कर दीजिए, उसकी अपॉर्चुनिटी बेहतर कर दीजिए, दैट विल रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूट significantly and change the negotiation between production and factors of production, etc. वो तो है, but how do you, I mean, do you still want to live with the same notions of property is something that I think is an additional thought, maybe difficult, maybe बड़ा मुश्किल है कोई इसको आगे लेके जाना, क्योंकि हमारी सोसाइटी में गालिबन उस लेवल पे हम वैसे भी सोचना नहीं चाहते. मुझे एक छोटी सी बात याद आई कि बड़े अरसे से शरीयत कोर्ट ने फैसला किया था ना कि फेडरल शरीयत कोर्ट ने कि लैंड रिफॉर्म जो है वो गैर शरई है या शरीयत के मुताबिक नहीं, और वो फिर बड़े अरसे से चैलेंज हुआ है वो फैसला. मिंटो साहब ने फाइल किया है, पर वो उसकी वो क्या कहते हैं हियरिंग ही नहीं होती, बहुत सालों से हियरिंग ही नहीं हो रही. और वो कोई रोस्टर वगैरह तो है नहीं ना जिसपे आप कहें कि जी बारी आ गई है सुन लो, वैसी बात तो नहीं है हमारे जुडिशियल सिस्टम में सुप्रीम कोर्ट, राइट. सो वो हियरिंग ही नहीं होती, तो फिर आप प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स की, ये तो सिर्फ ज़मीन की बात हो रही थी, आप तो इंडस्ट्रियल प्रॉपर्टी और वेल्थ पे भी कदम लगाना चाहते हैं रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन के लिए, तो वो तो बहुत फिर दूर की बात है. देन आई थिंक वन क्वेश्चन दैट वी रियली नीड टू देन थिंक अबाउट इज व्हाट इज a notion of property right that goes with the kind of society we want to create, and maybe that needs a rethinking and a reinvention rather than just going with what we are assuming to be the case, because it doesn't seem to be inherent to being human. And if it's not, if it's a created social construct, then maybe we can think about changing it significantly. ये जो एक्सेस पॉपुलेशन वाला आर्ग्यूमेंट है, ये आई एम स्टिल ग्रैपलिंग विद इट. आई डोंट नो कि मुझे पूरी तरह समझ आया है या नहीं, इन द सेंस के देयर इज अ लिंक ऑफ capitalism as it goes in the linear time sense from जो creative destruction का notion भी था शुम्पेटर का, और अब हम टेक्नोलॉजी वगैरह की टर्म में देखते हैं कि जी हमारी बहुत सारी एफर्ट जो है वो होती है somehow to save time. That's what technology is. Anything that facilitates humans to do something. Right? वो 3 Idiots में भी ऐसी कोई डेफिनेशन आमिर खान देते हैं कि भाई टेक्नोलॉजी is what allows us to save time in some one way or the other, change one form of energy or one form of material structure to another, etc. And I think usme science or technology seems to be going in that direction of getting more advanced in one way or the other, working harder. So there is no necessary connection between our ability to produce whatever is the level of enough, जो भी आप level enough का बना लें, for a population and the number of people needed to produce it. मैं दोबारा एक मुख्तलिफ तरीके से कहने की कोशिश करता हूँ कि लेकिन आपके पास अब टेक्नोलॉजी आ जाती है, ऐसे कंप्यूटर बन जाते हैं जो हर चीज़ कर लेते हैं, और वो बनाने के लिए सिर्फ आपको 100 बंदा चाहिए, आपके पास 1000 बंदा, तो वो 900 बंदा नोशन बन जाएगा एक्सेस लेबर का. लेकिन सो उसमें जो टेक्नोलॉजिकल प्रोसेसेस और साइंस है उसमें कोई ऐसी चीज नहीं है जो कहे कि नहीं हम वही काम सिर्फ करेंगे जिसमें सारे बंदे जो एबल बॉडीड हैं वो लग सकें, राइट. उसका अपना एक प्रोसेस चल रहा है ऑफ थिंकिंग एक्सेट्रा. तो हो सकता है ऐसी स्टेज भी आए वेयर वी आर एबल टू प्रोड्यूस वट एवर वी वॉन्ट विद वेरी लिटिल लेबर रिक्वायर्ड फ्रॉम ह्यूमन्स. सारा AI ले जाए, ऑटोमेट हो जाए, ये हो जाए, विच इज़ अ फियर. अब AI का लोग कई इंडस्ट्रीज में देख भी रहे हैं. यहाँ भी सवाल पूछा जा रहा है कि भाई टीचर्स भी की ज़रूरत भी पड़ेगी या नहीं, या कल AI यहाँ बैठा आपको आपसे बात कर रहा हो और फैसल बारी सरप्लस लेबर में आ गया। ये तो इससे अच्छा है कि उम्र तकरीबन रिटायरमेंट तक आ रही है, वरना the prospect could be dangerous. So I mean, there's no connection in that sense between technology, our ability to produce, and the use of labor. अभी जो ऐसे मोगलू जिसको नोबेल भी मिला है, उसकी आखिरी जो किताब है पावर पे, is a discussion around that, right? Power and technology. कि भाई वो जो how do you make sure that the use of technology is such that it doesn't cut people from leading productive lives, from having employment, from having power to decide how technology should be used? Is it inevitable in the process of technology that the use of technology comes given into whatever the technology itself is? Or is it that the use of technology is something that we decide as a people? And if we do that, then is it possible for us to use technology in ways that enhance human potential capability rather than lead to more asymmetric distribution of resources towards those who bring new technology in one way or the other, who own new technology in some sense, right? That's a massive question that, as I said, SMOU की किताब जो है वो most recent, उसमें एक तो हर साल किताब छाप देते हैं, कीपिंग अप विद हिम इज हार्ड, बट वो जो नई किताब है उसमें यही डिस्कशन ज़्यादा है कि भाई क्या लिंक क्या है बिटवीन, I mean 60s 70s में one of the things that was different was कि when we expanded technology उसमें even though there was an effect of labor reduction, but the effect of the expansion, हर एक को फ्रिज चाहिए था, हर एक को consumer product चाहिए, गाड़ियाँ चाहिए, फलाना चाहिए, that expansion took care of the increasing employment. So उसमें वो ख़वातीन भी आ गई, उसमें बाकी भी, पर वो post World War there was a massive expansion in employment despite the fact that technology was changing fast and there was a wave of अब वो होता है या नहीं, it could go the other way, right? अब टेक्नोलॉजी ऐसी आ सकती है जिसमें प्रोडक्टिविटी वगैरह तो बढ़े, प्रोडक्टिविटी सिर्फ सिंपली डेफिनेशन है ना, एक बंदा कितना प्रोड्यूस कर लेता है उसको हम प्रोडक्टिविटी कहते हैं, वो तो बढ़ जाए लेकिन एम्प्लॉयमेंट ना बढ़े, एम्प्लॉयमेंट कम हो जाए, ठीक, क्योंकि ओवरऑल एक्सपेंशन ना हो इन आवर एबिलिटी टू कंज्यूम एंड टू टेक many more products. तो ओवरऑल एक्सपेंशन सिर्फ इस तरह हो कि वो लोगों को जो हायर किया गया वो कम हो जाए, प्रोडक्शन उतनी या जो नॉर्मल बढ़ रही है वही बढ़े, बट अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट इम्पैक्ट उसका मैसिव आए. Now, in that case, so I don't know how useful it is to still think about in terms of excess labor in that sense. My own feeling is that we have to again rethink this notion of productive work and work itself. We have to rethink as a society कि भाई unemployed किसको कहते हैं, क्यों है वो unemployed, वो किस किस्म का काम employment होगी. एक बंदा है वो हमें ज़रूरत ही नहीं है इतने लोगों की, तो वो जो बाकी लोग हैं वो क्या है, वो फिर भी कोशिश करते रहें काम करना. तो उसके लिए फिर हम डिफाइन कैसे करें अपने आप को एज ह्यूमन, बिकॉज अभी तो हमारी बहुत सारी डेफिनेशन टाइड है बिटवीन आवर वर्क एंड आवर आइडेंटिटी. वो किस तरह से रीडिफाइन किया जाए उसको, आई थिंक दैट्स अ वेरी बेसिक एंड डिफिकल्ट क्वेश्चन. वो मार्क्स की उसकी जो मोर स्पेक्युलेटिव थिंकिंग थी ना, कि वो पता नहीं क्या कहता है कि सुबह को मैं काम करूं, दोपहर को मैं शायरी करूं, शाम को to be to fish in the morning, to do something else in the afternoon, and ये वो. I mean, Marx was aware of this problem, right? But of course he's at a very different time. I think now we need to rethink about this notion कि भाई इसका मतलब क्या, what is freedom like, and what does freedom mean, and how are we going to then finance that freedom if let's say 4 robots owned by कौन सबसे अमीर आदमी है, मस्क और कोई इस तरह का, वो पूरी दुनिया के लिए खाना बना दें तो बाकी फिर लोग क्या करें? वो एक्सेस लेबर ही कहलाएंगे. I mean, that notion taken to extreme sounds absurd, right? So वो प्रॉपर्टी राइट से भी लिंक्ड है कि फिर मस्क के पास नहीं होना चाहिए ना पावर के वो 4 रोबोट जो हैं उसी की मलकियतों पे, वो फिर सबकी मलकियत होने चाहिए, वो 4 रोबोट से पूरी दुनिया को खाना खिला रहे हैं. But also the fact कि फिर then we need to redefine what it means to be human, and maybe it is better to fish and so on, not of course in our weather, with our ये जो आजकल धुआं है, but nonetheless we need to rethink then this relation between work and employment and access to whatever is the notion of resources that we tie. और वो जो ये इस तरह के नोशन है ना, ये जो हम कह रहे हैं गारंटीड नेशनल इनकम, गारंटीड इनकम, बेसिक इनकम वगैरह के, वो इसी तरफ जा रहे हैं ना कि इससे फर्क नहीं पड़ता आप काम कर रहे हैं या नहीं, एक बेसिक इनकम आपको मिलनी चाहिए इररिस्पेक्टिव, क्योंकि है हमारे पास, हम प्रोड्यूस कर सकते हैं, तो फिर क्यों नहीं वो उसका कोई स्ट्रक्चर बनाया जाता. ये जो आई थिंक देयर इज सम मिक्सिंग एंड बड़े with all humility, as one point where I'm not sure that you've been able to, at least for me, separate the two. I think there's some mixing between the notion of a state and capitalism. आपने बहुत सही कहा, आपने कहा ना the hideous side of the state. Is it just hideous under capitalism, or is state hideous irrespective of what kind of system it is under? स्टेट की कोर्सिव पावर तो जो डिफाइन हुई है लिटरेचर में, कम से कम पॉलिटिकल साइंस जितनी मैंने देखी थी, उसमें उसका कोई कैपिटलिज्म से स्टेट हमेशा वो डिफाइन ही ऐसे कहते हैं, स्टेट हैज द पावर ओवर कोर्सिव एलिमेंट्स और कैन यूज द कोर्शन एज, और ये हॉब्स वगैरह उससे पहले से भी ये नोशन स्टेट के चल रहे हैं. तो वो आई मीन दैट पार्ट ऑफ द स्टेट के वो अपनी बात मनवा ले और उसको स्वीटन करे चाहे वेलफेयर से, पर अपनी बात मनवाना तो वो सोशलिस्ट स्टेट या नॉन कैपिटलिस्ट स्टेट्स भी शायद करती रही हैं. तो मुझे लगता है कि वो थोड़ी सी मिक्सिंग है जब आप मूव करते हैं ना बिटवीन द वर्ड स्टेट एंड कैपिटलिज्म. आई डोंट थिंक दे आर इंटरचेंजेबल फुली. State might have certain properties qua state which any state, irrespective of what the economic system in that society is, might still have in the state. That's a separate issue. मुझे पता नहीं मैं कितनी देर ठीक बिल्कुल. So I mean it's been tremendous pleasure to read this book. ये बड़ा एक और बेनिफिट था एहसन साहब को जानने का कि किसी वक्त उन्होंने कहा कि हों तो आके बोलना भी पड़ेगा और मैंने कहा फिर तो और ज़्यादा गौर से पढ़ना पड़ेगा. तो कई दफ़ा पढ़ने का मौका इसीलिए मिला कि क्योंकि आके बोलना भी था. आई एम सो वेरी ग्रेटफुल टू यू एहसन साहब एंड व्हाट एन अमेजिंग एफर्ट. थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर डूइंग इट.
I'm sure Ahsan Saab is as happy to have you as an interlocutor as you were to be invited by him. The fact that you read the book twice is more than many of us can do. Many of us are capable of doing. So thank you. Thank you for accepting his invitation and taking what he has said seriously. It's something that's worthy of serious attention and response. And now, can I open it up to the floor? Please feel free.
Thank you, sir.
Either Ahsan Saab or Ahsan Saab.
एक तो मैं आपको मुबारकबाद देना चाहूँगा कि बहुत सारे लोगों ने बात की कि बिजनेस स्कूल के लोगों से ये तवक्को तो नहीं होती कि वो ऐसा काम करेंगे, मार्क्स की बात करेंगे. ये खुद ही एक
सर ये दोनों
हाँ ये कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन है, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल में पाकिस्तान में ये कोई ट्रेंड बदल रहा है. वो एक कराची का बिजनेस स्कूल है, उसके डीन जो है वो अकबर ज़ैदी साहब बन गए. और अकबर ज़ैदी साहब ऐसी बातें करते हैं जैसे आप सब करते हैं, वो भी सोशलिज्म की. और तो शायद ये एक दुनिया में ट्रेंड आ रहा है पाकिस्तान में भी इस ट्रेंड को लीड कर रहा है कि हमने, आपको तो अभी प्रोफेसर है, आपसे असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर है, वो वहाँ डीन बन गए वहाँ पे। उनकी किताब आप पढ़ें, जो लोग पढ़ते हैं, तो वो तो मार्केट सिस्टम पाकिस्तान के अंदर जो कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन है उनको हाईलाइट करते हैं। बिजनेस तो ऐसी चीज़ों को पसंद नहीं करती, ऐसे लोगों को पसंद नहीं करती। तो लेकिन मैं, आपने बड़ा अच्छा किया वो जो कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस को, आई कमेंड यू फॉर doing it in a way that it was easily understandable by most of us. वो पूरी एक मार्क्सिस्ट थ्योरी को आपने सिंप्लीफाई किया अपने इस सारे इस डिस्कोर्स में। बारी साहब ने उसको एक थ्योरेटिकल सा एनालिसिस किया। तो मेरा जो आपके, जब आपने सोल्यूशन दिया, तो जब वो सोल्यूशन जो आपका है, जब मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन जो है वो शेयर्ड हो जाएंगे, तो वो कैपिटलिज्म नहीं होगा। इट विल नॉट बी कैपिटलिज्म। ठीक है, वो तो कोई और एक निज़ाम होगा जो सोशलिज्म कह लें उसको, सोशल डेमोक्रेसी भी नहीं होगा, वो भी एक कैपिटलिज्म का ही एक वर्जन है। तो वो तो शायद हम मुमकिनात में शायद नहीं है। ये अब आपसे मैं ऐसे बात कर रहा हूँ आपको कि जो आप जिस तरह देख रहे हैं, ये जो एलन मस्क जैसे लोग, जिस तरह दुनिया में और भी एलन मस्क पैदा हो रहे हैं, तो कैपिटलिज्म से जान तो छुड़ाई नहीं जा सकती। वो मार्garet थैचर ने एक लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल किया, वो कहती थी टीना। टीना एक सिंगर भी है, और लेकिन मार्garet थैचर का टीना जो है, इट मीन्स देयर इज नो अल्टरनेटिव। दिस इज व्हाट द न्यू लिबरल्स बिलीव, एंड न्यू लिबरल्स का जिक्र आया ही नहीं है इस पूरी डिस्कशन में। दुनिया अब न्यू लिबरल्स के हाथ में है, एंड द काइंड ऑफ कॉन्फिडेंस दैट दे एंजॉय in terms of their dominance and hegemony of the global world, they do not anticipate any challenge to that system. The way the whole system has been over time evolved, not on its own. The economics tells you that it has the kind of economics that I have been taught, शायद बारिश साहब पढ़ाते हो वो economics, वो तो कहती है ये खुद ब खुद हुआ है, वो किसी ने किया नहीं है, it has happened spontaneously. ये नेचुरल फोर्सेज हैं जिन्होंने ये किया। बट एट द बैक ऑफ इट, द वे इन्होंने बताया, इसके पीछे बहुत सारी फोर्सेज हैं। तो अब उन फोर्सेज को कैपिटलिज्म से जान नहीं छुड़ाई जा सकती। ऑप्शन हमारे पास ये है कि उस कैपिटलिज्म को कितना ह्यूमन बना सकते हैं, जिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देयर इज दिस डिस्कशन ऑन द वैराइटीज ऑफ कैपिटलिज्म। अब एक कैपिटलिज्म, मैं रात को किताब पढ़ रहा था कि the happiest place in the world is Finland, and Finland is a capitalist country. But Finland does many of the things that you would want a state to do, to make people happy and to make people feel worthy of living in a state. अब हमारे पास ये options हैं।
तो आपका सवाल ये है,
हाँ बस,
और एहसन साहब से
ये मेरा सवाल इन दोनों से है कि ये जो where do we go based on what you have described, and in terms of the response that मेरा तो ख्याल है कि वो तो नहीं, आप एक बहुत एक्सट्रीम ऑप्शन पे जा रहे हैं, वो शायद मेरी तरह की बात, बारिश साहब मेरी तरह की बात कर रहे होंगे। तो we have to find a solution, a remedy through these extremes के कहाँ जाना है आपने। Thank you.
सो देखिए डॉक्टर साहब, जो मार्garet थैचर का वो कमेंट था, so that was made in a particular context and in a particular time, and this was 1980s. So since then we have about 4 decades of experience of what neoliberalism has done to the world. So I think the realization has now started to creep in globally कि ये सिस्टम चल नहीं सकता because of one simple reason, कि जिस किस्म की इनइक्वलिटीज़ ऑफ इनकम एंड वेल्थ इस वक्त हमें नज़र आती है ना, तो विद दीज टाइप्स ऑफ इनइक्वलिटीज़ ऑफ इनकम एंड वेल्थ, डेमोक्रेसी डज नॉट मेक एनी सेंस एट ऑल. So you can't have a democracy where one person is Elon Musk and another person, their wages are stuck at the level of 1964. So look at what has happened to environment. Look at how the world has failed to manage the surplus population on one hand and also failed to provide them basic income on the other. सो बेसिकली व्हाट यू आर सेइंग कि अगर ठीक है काम नहीं मिल रहा तो खैर है, फिर तुम्हारी मर्जी है, मरो खाओ पियो जो। तो आई थिंक ये चल नहीं सकता, इट विल वेरी सून बी रिप्लेस्ड बाई समथिंग, क्योंकि अब ये सिस्टम उस जगह के ऊपर पहुंच गया है कि जहाँ पे इट हैज़ एक्चुअली बिकम अ कंस्ट्रेंट ऑन द डेवलपमेंट ऑफ प्रोडक्टिव फोर्सेस। देखिए ना, पेटेंट्स उसकी बहुत बड़ी मिसाल है। आप में से जो साइंटिस्ट हैं वो मुझसे बेहतर जानते होंगे कि हर चीज़, हर पॉसिबल चीज़ के ऊपर इंटेलेक्चुअल प्रॉपर्टी राइट है, हर पॉसिबल चीज़ के ऊपर। So that means कि if you want to really do research, then you have to negotiate so many patents, which then becomes a drain, a constraint. So the existing property rights जो हैं, they are not conducive to the development of productive forces. They are actually a constraint. So something has to give. So there has to be some change in the property relations जो है वो, which is the fundamental question. Social democracy की आपने बात की. Social democracy I believe to be an unstable system. It's middle of the road. And the problem of walking in the middle of the road is that you get hit by both sides. That is the reason that the most successful experiment of social democracy was partly rolled back in Scandinavia starting in 1990s. So I'm not against that, but I'm saying that as a long-term solution, so we can't consider social democracy to be a stable system which can last for ever. So that's my response to that, and I think we really need to move towards जो बारी साहब बात कर रहे हैं ना कि fundamental question ये है कि what is the property relations that we want to have a society. जिस दिन हमें ये बात समझ आ गई ना कि ये जो property relations हैं they are not a force of nature. ये जो मार्केट है इट्स नॉट अ फोर्स ऑफ नेचर, इट्स नॉट ग्रेविटी, यू आर स्टक विद दैट, यू कांट एस्केप फ्रॉम दैट. ये प्रॉपर्टी रिलेशंस हमने बनाए हैं, ये मार्केट हमने क्रिएट की है. तो दैट मीन्स कि अगर ये प्रॉपर्टी रिलेशंस हमारे फ़ायदे में नहीं चल रहे तो वी नीड टू थिंक ऑफ सम वेज, मार्क्स की बात ना भी माने, फाइंड सम अदर वे कि जहाँ पे ये प्रॉपर्टी रिलेशंस कैन बी डिप्लॉयड टू द बेटरमेंट ऑफ द पीपल. अब देखें जिस ज़माने में ये प्रॉपर्टी रिलेशंस के बारे में ये सारा ओरिजिनल लिटरेचर 18th सेंचुरी 17th सेंचुरी में हुआ था, उस वक्त प्रॉपर्टी wasn't that big and property was very widely distributed. So that's why it made sense for all these Locke and Hobbes and Adam Smith to talk about the sanctity of private property, because that would ensure that the fruit of labor goes to the person who labors. Now, because of the property relations, now it's a different form of property. It's not that distributed property that now exists. It's now mega property, concentrated property, and the fruits of labor basically go to someone who does not labor. मेरी फेवरेट मिसाल जो है वो बिल गेट्स की है. बिल गेट्स जो है वो became the richest person of the world in a span of just 7 years. And he did not become the richest person because of the product that he had. The product was wonderful, but he became the richest person because of the piece of paper, the patent that he had, the property rights that he had in his pocket. उसकी वजह से वो बना ना. हालांकि ये है कि जो वेल्थ क्रिएशन है, बारी साहब ने भी उसकी तरफ इशारा किया, इट्स एक्चुअली a social process. So when it is social process, then everyone has contributed to that जो है वो. तो ये जो अभी वाले प्रॉपर्टी रिलेशंस हैं ये चल नहीं सकते. समथिंग हैज़ टू चेंज जो है वो. जी
मैं सिर्फ ये कहूँगा कि गेम थ्योरी में ये एक बहुत बड़ा मसला है कि भाई इक्विलिब्रियम कैसे चेंज होता है. यू हैव इक्विलिब्रिया 2 3 4, हाउ डू यू जंप फ्रॉम वन इक्विलिब्रियम टू अनदर. उसका कोई हमारे पास जवाब नहीं है. वो रेवोल्यूशंस भी हैं, वो अपॉर्चुनिटीज़ और भी आ जाती हैं ये वो. बट ये बहुत बड़ा सवाल है कि हम ये कह रहे हैं कि जो पावर रिलेशंस आउटकम्स इस वक्त बना रहे हैं वही पावर रिलेशंस उन आउटकम्स को बदल दें. ये नहीं होना, ये हमें पता नहीं होगा. नहीं, वो क्यों बदलेंगे? उनके फ़ायदे में है ये पावर रिलेशंस, तो वो आउटकम को क्यों बदलने देंगे? ठीक है. और ये बहुत बड़ा सवाल है कि फिर अगर वो चेंज नहीं करने दे रहे तो फिर चेंज आएगा कहाँ से. एंड दैट इज़ आई थिंक दैट्स $1 million क्वेश्चन जो इस वक्त पाकिस्तान में तो हम बहुत इससे स्ट्रगल कर रहे हैं ना, चाहे वो 26वीं तरमीम हो या ना हो या 27वीं 28वीं में आए. is that the process of change that will change the underlying things that are being caused? And most of us think they won't. This is a almost a reinforcement of the same equilibria being done, right? चाहे वो डिसेंट को चैलेंज करना है या कुछ और चीज़ें हैं, so वो दूसरी साइड कहाँ से आएगी?
Thank you so much. My question to Dr. Bari. Okay.
माइक उसके पास
Sorry, so I'm asking ki, the change which came around in Bangladesh, that was called a monsoon revolution. So how do you see that change? Is it a restructuring of the system, or is it just the change of heads? Or in the larger scheme of things, ki Bangladesh have that welfare system also, where non-state actors like the Grameen Bank is also active there. So how do you like make sense of all these? Thank you.
मुझे तो अभी पता नहीं है इसमें क्या चेंज है। अभी तो मेरे मतलब है शुरू होने लगा है वो, शायद इसकी आउटकम्स तो ये आएंगी ना तो पता लगेगा। अभी तो क्या हुआ है, सिर्फ जो सिटिंग प्राइम मिनिस्टर थी उनको हटाया है ना, तो वो चेंज तो नहीं कहलाता, वो तो हम हर दूसरे दिन कर लेते हैं। मेरा मतलब है स्कूल में टीचर हटाना मुश्किल है, प्राइम मिनिस्टर हटाना क्या मुश्किल है, राइट? वो तो हर वक्त हम करते रहते हैं। सो इसलिए मैं अभी आई एम वेरी मच ऑन द फेंस ऑन बांग्लादेश कि पता नहीं ये चेंज है या नहीं। बांग्लादेश में हमेशा द स्ट्रीट हैज़ हैड मोर पावर, राइट? वो आप कभी ढाका अगर गए हो, वो कहते हैं 3 चीज़ें ढाका में हर वक्त यू कैन नेवर प्रेडिक्ट: ट्रैफिक, बारिश and protest. So I'm not sure if this is a first sort of clarion call for change, yeah, whether it will fizzle out or not.
The buying and selling of kidneys and human organs, and this further ties that does a moral economy really exist or not?
अच्छा सर, एक तो कंटिन्यूशन ऑफ द लास्ट क्वेश्चन कि इस पे प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स, जब किडनी बेचने और इस पे इलीगल जो ट्रैफिकिंग है, इस पे भी प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स की बात की जा सकती है? क्या सोशली ओन प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स हैं कि इंडिविजुअल हैं किडनी के? और दूसरा सर, राना साहब से मेरा सवाल है कि आपने जो बुनियादी आपकी बात थी वेलफेयर स्टेट का जो मकसद है वो सरप्लस पॉपुलेशन की मैनेजमेंट है। पाकिस्तान के अगर आप तनाजुर में देखें तो हमारे सरकारी इदारे इसमें बहुत माहिर हैं, मतलब ओवर हायरिंग, हमारा PIA, हमारी रेलवे और सो ऑन सो फोर्थ। और जो हम बात कर रहे थे कि वो बेसिक पे भी गारंटी करते हैं, तो क्या जो पाकिस्तान का रियासती निज़ाम है उसको बहुत इफ़ेक्टिवली वेलफेयर निज़ाम नहीं कहा जा सकता, कम से कम सरप्लस पॉपुलेशन मैनेजमेंट की हद तक? और बारी साहब से इसी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में है कि जो प्राइवेटाइजेशन ऑफ हायर एजुकेशन है वो तो गारंटी करती है सरप्लस पॉपुलेशन को, बिकॉज वो क्रिएट करती है जॉब सीकिंग या वेज सीकिंग लोगों को। तो उसके बारे में आपके क्या ख्याल है? थैंक यू।
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Bari and Dr. Rana. Thank you so much for the talk. As an A-level student, इस तरह की चीज़ें हमें नॉर्मल क्लास में नहीं सुनने को मिलती। मेरे 2 सवाल थे। पहला सवाल डॉक्टर बारी से था। डॉक्टर बारी, यू टॉक्ड अबाउट अ यूनिवर्सल बेसिक इनकम ब्रीफली। अगर इस तरह की चीज़ हम लोग एक्चुअली स्टेट्स में करें तो where do you think the capital for universal basic income, because it would be very substantial, where do you think it should come from? And if it should come from the same tax budget जिससे welfare आ रहा है, then wouldn't we compromise on welfare? And if we would compromise on welfare, do you think this is something that is better than welfare and maybe one of the solutions to the current problems that have been identified? डॉक्टर राना, आपसे मेरा सवाल था कि आपने सोशल इन्वेस्टमेंट की बात की कि इट्स वेरी सब्सटैंशियल, लॉट्स ऑफ स्टैटिस्टिक्स यू गेव फॉर दिस. So if we are providing a lot of money to subsidies, education, training, etc., and if so much money is going into the worker, then what is actually the underlying reason for, in Lahore for example, the real wage decreasing in the past 20 years? I get that some money is still being like held by the producer, but if we are funneling so much money into it, shouldn't the wage at least decrease to some extent? What is the underlying reason behind this in your opinion? Thank you so much.
As it's getting late, with your permission, just these questions of our speakers and respond to that, and then we will call it the.
अच्छा जी, सो पहला जो है वो मॉरल इकोनॉमी किडनी वाला जो क्वेश्चन जो अब देखिए ना, मेरे ख्याल में जो फंडामेंटल चीज़ हमें यहाँ पे सोचने वाली है वो ये नहीं है कि एक बंदे का कि डज समवन हैव फुल ओनरशिप ऑफ देयर बॉडी एंड दे आर फ्री टू सेल दैट और नॉट. द क्वेश्चन टू बी आस्क्ड इज दैट what type of a society do we have in which someone has to sell their kidney? Donating a kidney to a loved one is an act of nobility. But having to sell a kidney, मेरे ख्याल में fundamental question हुआ है. So if we are at that level, तो there is something fundamentally wrong with that society level. अच्छा, दूसरा आपने वो गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स की बात जो वो की, तो देखिए पाकिस्तान में जो ना रियल वेलफेयर स्टेट वो गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट्स के लिए ही है. यानी आप दुनिया के किसी मुल्क में चले जाएं, अमेरिका में चले जाएं, तो वहाँ पे हर साल मुसीबत पड़ी होती है कि जी कांग्रेस ने बजट नहीं पास किया तो सरकारी मुलाजमों को तनख्वाहें नहीं मिलेंगी और ये सर्विसेज वगैरह बंद हो जाएंगे. ये पाकिस्तान वाहिद मुल्क है कि पैसा हो ना हो, कर्जा लेना पड़े, नोट छापने पड़े, सरकारी मुलाजमों की तनख्वाहें और पेंशन जो है वो नहीं रुकेगी. सो इन रियल सेंस जो है वो सरकारी मुलाजमों के लिए अगर कोई वेलफेयर स्टेट है तो वो पाकिस्तान ही जो है वो है. So the government of Pakistan is very very generous when it comes to rewarding its own employees. अच्छा, जो यूनिवर्सल बेसिक इनकम की आपने बात जो है वो की ना, तो मैंने एक्चुअली कई दफ़ा उसकी कैलकुलेशंस की हैं. तो अगर फ़र्ज़ कर लें कि हम एवरेज सिटीज़न को बेसिक इनकम प्रोवाइड करते हैं एट द रेट ऑफ 15,000 रुपीज़ या 16,000 रुपीज़ पर मंथ पर हाउस होल्ड. 32,000 इज़ द मिनिमम वेज. सो 50% ऑफ दैट अगर हम कर लें कि ये दिस इज़ दी बेसिक इनकम, सो लेट्स प्रोवाइड इट टू एवरी हाउस होल्ड, नो क्वेश्चन आस्क्ड. और जो टॉप क्विंटाइल है उसको एक्सक्लूड कर लें बिकॉज दैट डजेंट नीड दैट, और बहुत सारे तरीके हैं उसको एक्सक्लूड करने के जो है वो. तो टोटल उसकी कॉस्ट जो है वो, यू विल बी सरप्राइज टू नोट, वो आती है अबाउट 6.4 और 6.5 ट्रिलियन रुपीज़. दैट्स ऑल. यानी सारे साल में अगर हम 6,500 ट्रिलियन यानी 6500 अरब रुपया खर्च करने को तैयार हो जाएं, तो हम पाकिस्तान के बॉटम 4 क्विंटाइल्स के हर हाउस होल्ड को नो क्वेश्चन आस्क्ड एवरी मंथ 16,000 रुपया जो वो दे सकते हैं, विच वुड इमीडिएटली एलिमिनेट पॉवर्टी फ्रॉम पाकिस्तान इमीडिएटली. अच्छा, अब क्वेश्चन ये आता है कि ये पैसा कहाँ से आएगा, बिकॉज यू नो इट अपीयर्स टू बी अ लार्ज अमाउंट. जो इट्स नॉट. इफ यू जस्ट लुक एट द टैक्स एग्जम्पशंस दैट वी गिव, सो दिस ईयर टैक्स एग्जम्पशंस जो है वो मैंने आपको फिगर प्रेजेंट जो वो की थी, दैट इज 4 ट्रिलियन रुपीज़. सो 4,000 अरब तो वहाँ पे से आ गया. उसके बाद उसके ऊपर जो वो सब्सिडीज ऐड करते हैं जो हम देते हैं, शुगर के ऊपर सब्सिडी देते हैं, इस चीज़ के ऊपर सब्सिडी देते हैं, फर्टिलाइज़र मिलों को सब्सिडी देते हैं, उसके ऊपर जो है वो 2600 अरब की पेंशन ऐड कर लें एंड सो ऑन. बेसिक इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम भी नहीं चलाना पड़ेगा क्योंकि सबको आप इन एनी केस जो वो पैसे जो है वो दे रहे हैं. तो एक्चुअली ये है कि इन प्रोग्रामों को बंद करें और सबको अगर यूबीआई जो है वो हम दे दें तो हमारे पास पैसे बच जाएंगे. ठीक है, वो क्यों नहीं दिया जाता उसकी एक अलग से बात जो है. दूसरा आपका क्वेश्चन ये था कि जी सोशल इन्वेस्टमेंट व्हाई हैज़ इट नॉट ट्रांसलेटेड इनटू एन इंक्रीज इन द रियल वेजेस. सो देखिए ना, सोशल इन्वेस्टमेंट हुई बट इट्स अ क्वेश्चन ऑफ द relative power which the employers and the employees can exercise. Since employees are not organized and since I believe कि वो एक रिजर्व आर्मी ऑफ लेबर भी है, सो इस वजह से इट इज़ पॉसिबल फॉर द रियल वेज टू गो डाउन. इसके ऊपर स्टडीज़ जो वो हुई हैं कि जिन कंट्रीज़ में लेबर ऑर्गेनाइज थी वहाँ पे किस किस्म का सिस्टम डेवलप हुआ और जिन कंट्रीज़ में लेबर ऑर्गेनाइज नहीं थी वहाँ पे किस किस्म का. सो लुक एट द डिफरेंस बिटवीन यूरोप एंड नॉर्थ अमेरिका. नॉर्थ अमेरिका में लेबर ऑर्गेनाइज नहीं थी तो आज भी सबको हेल्थ इंश्योरेंस नहीं है. यूरोप में लेबर ऑर्गेनाइज थी, सो पावर थी ना, यूनियन एक्टिविटी थी, ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो है वो थी, तो दैट कुड देन एक्ट एज अ काउंटरवेलिंग फोर्स जो है. सो इट इज़ बिकॉज ऑफ दैट रियली कि जो बेनिफिट है ऑफ दिस मैसिव स्पेंडिंग, और वो स्पेंडिंग भी एम्प्लॉयर का नहीं हो रहा, स्पेंडिंग भी 57% जो है वो बॉटम क्विंटाइल्स का जो वो हो रहा है, उसका बेनिफिट कैप्चर वो कर लेता है सारे का सारा जो है. सो दैट इज़ द रीज़न कि सोशल इन्वेस्टमेंट हो भी रही है, इसी तरह सोशल कंजम्पशन भी हो रही है, लेकिन उसको बेनिफिट जो है वो नहीं हो रहा.
सिर्फ रह गया वो प्राइवेटाइजेशन ऑफ हायर एजुकेशन की जो बात की गई थी. लेकिन हायर एजुकेशन की प्राइवेटाइजेशन ये बड़ा मुश्किल सा सवाल है. हायर एजुकेशन आप सब्सिडाइज करना चाहते हैं, लेकिन हम उसको इतने कम लेवल पे सब्सिडाइज कर रहे थे कि फिर क्वालिटी बहुत कॉम्प्रोमाइज़ थी। क्या ये बेहतर है, या ये बेहतर है कि आप कहें, साफ कह दें कि यार जिसके पास पैसा है वो ले ले तालीम, बाकी रहने दें? That's a decision that a society has to in some ways make, right? Because यही K-12 में भी यही हो रहा है ना। हम पंजाब में 600 बिलियन या कितना खर्च करते हैं तालीम पे, लेकिन हमें पता है आउटकम्स जो हम चाह रहे हैं वो उसके करीब भी नहीं है। सही तालीम देने के लिए इससे ज़्यादा, काफ़ी ज़्यादा खर्चा है, हम उस पर भी राज़ी नहीं होते। हम वो यूनिवर्सल राइट भी रख रहे हैं 25A, लेकिन उसको इम्प्लीमेंट भी नहीं कर रहे। ये पॉलिटिक्स है जो उस कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन की, जिसका एसन ने बड़ी क्लियर कि आप यू कीप बैलेंसिंग दैट। You don't say कि openly say कि this is for the few, but you also don't want to then provide the full benefit as well. तो वो हायर के अभी खबर एक दिन आई थी, मुझे किसी ने फ़ोन भी किया था, किसी जर्नलिस्ट ने, कि ये प्राइवेट ये HEC के पैसे बंद करने की बात हो रही है कि वो यूनिवर्सिटी को कहें आप खुद ही करें, राइट? Obviously it will impact a very large number of people who are getting fairly low fee education, और वो आप आर्ग्यूमेंट दे सकते हैं कुछ तो मिल रहा है ना, वो बंद हो जाएगा अनलेस स्कॉलरशिप भी आए। लेकिन दूसरी तरफ प्रॉब्लम ये है कि क्या इतने पे ही रखना है आपने? तो फिर वो प्रॉब्लम ये होती है कि वी हैव वन ऑफ द हाईएस्ट लेवल्स ऑफ अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट्स इन द एजुकेटेड यूथ, और उसकी वजह ये है कि वो 600 PhD भी बैठा था HEC के PhD करके, और उन्हें यूनिवर्सिटियाँ जो स्टार्व्ड हैं फॉर फैकल्टी, कोई हायर करने पे राज़ी नहीं था क्योंकि वो क्वालिटी मिसमैच भी हो रहा था, राइट? सो व्हाट्स द राइट इक्विलिब्रियम फॉर दैट मार्केट विदाउट थिंकिंग थ्रू कि यार आप पैसे और रिसोर्सेज वगैरह कहाँ से लाएंगे? आई डोंट थिंक वो मुमकिन भी है।
Thank you to Rana Saab, Ahsan Saab, and Bari Saab for, and then thank you to you, to the audience. 2 घंटे आप बैठे हैं, and the fact that I can see very few people left, and they left for valid reasons. This speaks to your interest, and we can stay afterwards to chat if you like with both, and then again, and if you give me, with your permission, first a heads up. Our next session will be in 3 weeks, and we have Dr. Azra Raza. What Ahsan Rana Saab talked about in the economic sphere, she's going to talk about in the medical sphere. World-renowned expert on cancer research and cancer treatment from Columbia University. And again, the same thing with Dr. Ahsan Rana Saab. She is writing and doing her scholarship on the basis of not just academic research, but personal experience. And you can tell the difference between, that scholar who is bridging personal experience and scholarship, bringing them together in their work, the very quality of what is being produced. And so this will be, I think, November 22nd. It's a Friday, so please mark that on your calendar right now. And for both of my colleagues, if you listen carefully to what they're saying that we need to start asking some very very basic questions. What is ownership? What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be, what is value? Okay? Now, these questions at one level have been answered by Enlightenment thought at a certain point in our history, and it is assumed that there is no alternative. Now, if I heard both of my colleagues correctly, in their own way, they're saying that we have to think about some alternatives, because those answers are not working. Not only are they not working, and I think Rana Saab in the question and answer, if you listen to him carefully, the way ownership is being defined right now, it is undermining the very basic health of a healthy democratic society in which citizens have a meaningful say in the political process. These two things cannot go together right now for much longer. In the United States, there's a presidential election in a couple of days, and it's literally billions of dollars that are being spent by the two candidates. In a senatorial election, you need tens of millions of dollars to contest a seat. Now, is that healthy for democracy? What does it do for democracy? You can see the tension, the contradiction. So we do need to rethink some of those very, very basic questions. And I will end with this on a light note, kind of a light note. Okay, I don't know how light it is. It is well, it's light in the sense that it's poetry. Okay. This is Allama Iqbal's nazm, Lenin Khuda ke Huzoor mein. Lenin in the presence of God. Lenin has passed away, he has gone up to the heavens, and he's standing in front of God. Okay? Because my Urdu is so bad, I don't want to, but the first third of it is Lenin saying, I am sorry, I made a mistake. That I did not recognize or that I did not accept your reality when I was in the world. Now that I'm here, मेरी आंखें खुल गई हैं, तो अब मैं आपकी हकीकत को मानता हूँ. That's the first third. I'm going to pick up right after he does that. Right after he admits his mistake and एक लिहाज से he apologizes, he acknowledges it. एक बात अगर मुझको इजाजत हो तो पूछूं, हल कर न सके जिसको हकीमों के मकालात. जब तक मैं जिया खैमाए अफलाक के नीचे, कांटे की तरह दिल में खटकती रही ये बात. गुफ्तार के असलूब पे काबू नहीं रहता, जब रूह के अंदर मुतलातम हो ख्यालात. ये वाला सवाल, कौन सा सवाल है? वो कौन सा आदम है कि तू जिसका है माबूद? वो आदम खाकी के जो है ज़ेरे समावात. मशरक के खुदावंद सफ़ायदान फरंगी, मगरिब के खुदावंद दरख्शिंदा फ़लिज़ात. ये सिर्फ अल्लामा कर सकते हैं. वो कौन सा खुदा है जिसका तू है माबूद? तेनू कौन खुदा मनने वाले ने जो दुनिया मैं छोड़ के आया हूं? मशरिक के खुदावंद सफ़ायदान फरंगी. The people in the east, उनका खुदा कौन है? मगरिब के खुदावंद दरख्शिंदा फ़लिज़ात, शाइनिंग मेटल्स. तो आप किसका खुदा रह गए? यूरोप में बहुत रोशनी इल्म हुनर है, हक ये है कि बेचश्मा है वहाँ है ये जुलुमात. रहनाये तामीर में रौनक में सफ़ा में, गिरजों से कहीं बढ़ के हैं बैंकों की इमारत. जाहिर में तिजारत है, हकीकत में जुआ है, सूद एक का लाखों के लिए मर्गे मफाजात. ये इल्म, ये हिकमत, ये तदब्बुर, ये हुकूमत, पीते हैं लहू, देते हैं तलीमे मसावात. बेकारियों उरियानियों और मैखारियों इफलास, क्या कम है फरंगी मदनियत के फतूहात. वो कौम के फैज़ाने समावी से हो महरूम, हद उसके कमालात की है बरको बुखारात. है दिल के लिए मौत मशीनों की हुकूमत, एहसास मुरव्वत को कुचल देते हैं आलात. आसार तो कुछ नजर आते हैं कि आखिर तब्दीर को तकदीर के शातिर ने किया मात. मैं खाने की बुनियाद में आया है तजलजुल, बैठे हैं इसी फिक्र में पीराने खराबात। पीराने खराबात में नज़र आ गया कि वो जो अल्टरनेटिव है ना, द कंडीशंस फॉर इट्स इमर्जेंस, उनको नज़र आ गया है। मैं खाने की बुनियाद में आया है तजल्जुल, उन्होंने देख लिया है। दिस इज 1930 समथिंग, 1920। चेहरों पे जो सुर्खी नजर आती है सरे शाम, या गाजा है ये सागर और मीना की करामात। तू कादिर और आदिल है मगर तेरे जहां में हैं तल्ख बहुत बंदाए मजदूर के औकात। वो जो रियल वेजेस, कब डूबेगा सरमाया परस्ती का सफीना, दुनिया है तेरी मुंतजरे रोजे मकाफात। दिस इज 1920, 1930, and this is Lenin in front of God. लेनिन ने अपनी फरियाद जो भी है पेश कर दिया। फिर आगे है फरिश्तों का गीत। Then there are the angels who are listening to this. Then as a chorus they respond to what they have heard from Lenin. And then आखिर में है फरमाने खुदा, वो जो then खुदा दोनों पार्टीज को सुन के वो अपना। And this is where the basic, the basic questions, we have to go back and start asking those basic questions. And those basic questions can only be asked and answered from the point of view of mythos. It is जो मेरे colleagues ने कहा है, right, is to rethink the answers to the questions. But in order to rethink the answers to the questions, we have to question the notion of the state of nature that underpins the answers which have been in vogue for the past 300 years. And is there another description of the state of nature? And where would that description come from? So thank you very much, and we hope to see you possibly for in a few weeks. Gigi.